to Module 5. This is Part 2 of Pisano. So this is the Pisano Innovation Landscape Map. This talks to us about the different types of innovation that are described in the reading. And are, when this reading came out, when this article came out rather, this was a pretty novel way of looking at different types of innovation. So the first type of innovation, well, actually, let's first describe the axes. So the vertical axis is talking about business model innovation. So when you have a routine innovation, this is something that sits within your business model and within your technical competencies. So it's something that you can do every day, and most companies do routine innovation on a regular basis. This is new generations of products, maybe like the example here, a new Pixar 3D animated film, a new Vanguard Index film or fund, a new generation of BMW, or a new Ford Explorer. So routine innovation is something we're very comfortable with. We're comfortable with the business model. We're comfortable with the technical capabilities. And this is where we make a lot of money. We'll see that in the next slide, but although, Pisano kind of goes into that detail and says, even though it doesn't sound, really sexy, it is where people make most of the money. Apple and the generations of iPhones, they made, millions and millions of dollars just simply by, simple routine innovations. And then as we move across the, the horizontal axis, radical innovation requires new technical competencies. So we're in the R&D process. We're looking for new ways of doing something. So the examples, biotechnology. So this is for pharmaceutical companies. We talked about this in the last video. We're moving from chemical substances into biotechnology. Jet engines for aircraft manufacturers, fiber optic cables for telecommunications companies. So it requires a different type of technology. So it's the same business. So at the end of the day, especially, for pharmaceuticals, we're still going to create a drug. We're just going to do it with new technology that maybe creates, perhaps maybe it's better for the patients. Maybe it's faster. Maybe more sustainable. Maybe it's cheaper. So whatever it is, it requires more technology, but it is our same business model. We're still producing the same thing that we did before. As we go up the vertical axis, we're looking for a new business model. So when we're talking about disruptive innovation, which is it's a word that we use sort of generically like Kleenex, disruptive innovation, but Pisano describes it in a very specific way, which helps us to understand the differences in these types of innovation. So disruptive innovation requires a new business model. So some of the examples he gives are open source software, like we talked about, things like Linux, video on demand for DVD rental companies, ride sharing services for taxi and limo companies. So a lot of this disruptive innovation is something that's really hard for the existing company to do. It's not as hard as architectural. This is really where the changes become very daunting for mature companies. But disruptive innovation is still something that's tough for a company to do, because you might be giving up a source of revenue. And it might be something that, a lot of companies, when you think of disruptive innovation, some of the sayings are either you can do it to yourself or you can let somebody else do it to you. So things like open source software, right? So where historically you may have paid for this software, like for instance with Sun Microsystems, people paid for Sun OS in the past, and then they gave it away for free, to the Linux organization, where it was just open source, available for anywhere. So the revenue stream was gone. Now, at the time that Sun contributed this, of course, they weren't making a whole lot of money from Sun OS anymore. They had moved on to a new operating system, so that was a little bit easier. If you think about video on demand versus DVD rental services, you're talking about storefronts with, videotapes in them going to an online streaming service. So what do we do with our bricks and mortar? How are we, at a company level, how do we actually conceptualize the idea of, of people downloading a video versus walking into a store and renting it? So a lot of times these business model innovations are really tough for companies to understand how to grab hold of it. Architectural innovations are often, like I often think of architectural as a disruptive innovation, but Pisano describes things very specifically, and I think it helps a lot in categorizing these innovations into very specific areas where we can then provide strategies for managing it. So architectural are the most impactful to mature companies. So it is a change to the new business model, and it is a technology change at the same time. So these are the really big disruptions. And so some of the examples: personalized medicine for pharmaceutical companies, digital imaging for Polaroid and Kodak. So this is digital cameras, internet search for newspapers. So these last two examples are ones that you guys might be too young to really remember, how impactful digital cameras were to film cameras. And as a matter of fact, one of my nieces she's an artist, and she likes to go back sometimes to film because she likes the uniqueness of the way that film, produces a picture. It's in no way as clear and vivid as a digital photo now, but she likes that creativity to it. So we're kind of having sort of a rebirth of some of these things like the Polaroids and things like that have come back as a novel thing, but the quality of the picture is so low compared to like a digital camera. But we'll talk about this. So Otterbeck has an interesting way of explaining how these architectural innovations come about, and we'll study it more when we get to that section. But they are extremely impactful. So companies like Kodak, and Polaroid basically ceased to exist for a long time, or their business model was so collapsed they went from being a gigantic company to something very tiny. Because you will maintain a certain level of consumer base for a product that's been disrupted, but it's very, very small. Just people, the laggards, right, who won't get on board, they're going to still have film cameras, but very, very, very small, number. Internet search for newspapers. So the internet really, really impacted the publishing industry. The idea that we go from a piece of paper that we hold in our hands, it's part of our habits. Every morning we have our newspaper and our coffee and we figure out what's going on in the day, to getting all of our news on our phones, on our watches, having things pop up that are specific to us. We're not just reading everything in the paper. We're just reading things that we said, hey, I'm really interested in sports. I'm interested in international arts and whatever it is. And now the news is sorted for us. So this was a major impact to publishing companies, and it's very difficult for companies to manage an architectural disruption, because not only do they not have the technology in place to compete in the space. Publishing companies didn't, when this disruption took place, they didn't have the capacity to deliver news on websites and news on social media and things like that. That was something they had to develop over 15, 20 years, and that was a big disruption for them. So and in addition to that, the business model itself was not conducive to their business. So newspapers never gave away news. So you bought a newspaper, you paid for it, and it was yours, and the news was paid for. In the new digital world, Apple News is on my phone. I don't pay any money for it. It's free, and I can get most of my news for free. So that business model is one that is based, instead of on subscription, on advertising. And so that, although, obviously newspapers were used to selling advertisements within the newspaper, it was a very different way for them to do it. And in addition to the fact that because they didn't have a technology platform for that, there was no advertising going on. So there was a big shift, and this had a major impact on publishing companies. So these architectural innovations generally come from outside of these mature firms. So it's somebody else coming up with the idea that has no stake in the company or in the industry. So things like Tesla, for example, and the electric and autonomous car that they're producing, they were at the time brand new to the space. They don't have the history and the burdens of having been in business for 100 years. They do things very differently, and it was extremely disruptive to the industry, and still is. So this is a really effective way of being able to articulate and understand the different types of innovation. It's one of my favorite things from Pisano. So definitely, use it as a reference. Okay, so here we're going to go through, and we'll probably do this quickly because we've kind of gone through this. Routine innovation builds on a company's existing technological competencies and fits within its business model. It is the easiest and most lucrative form of innovation. Disruptive innovation, a new business model, but not necessarily a new technological breakthrough. An example is Android's given away for free, that the operating system Android, versus Apple and Microsoft that sell their operating system. A radical innovation, purely technological, so pharmaceutical switching to biotechnology from chemically synthesized drugs. And then architectural innovation combines technological and business innovation, so digital photography, as we've talked about. These are the most challenging for incumbents to pursue because they are just completely different from what the incumbent's doing today. So managing trade-offs within innovation, we're talking about different ways of innovation getting to market. So you've got a supply push, which is developing technology and then creating a market for it. So it can be more suitable when an identified market doesn't exist. TI, the example that they give in the reading, TI created the integrated circuit and followed with a handheld calculator. So this is a way of taking an innovation and finding a practical use for it. So a lot of times an innovation might be very complex, and very few companies may be able to leverage it. So you may be able to create a product on your own that you can sell and make money doing so. Not just for your innovation, but from a product perspective as well. And then demand pull innovations, finding customers highly challenging problems and then figuring out how the company's cutting edge technologies can solve them. This is something that technology companies did a lot of, especially consulting firms like IBM. They would go into a company and they were highly respected. So they were called in to help solve a particular problem. And from that solving of a problem, they might be able to create a product that other people can use as well. So this is very lucrative for companies because most of the time the company that calls them in to solve the problem is paying them to solve the problem, might even be contributing to the research and development associated with it. There may be, obviously in some situations they may be limited to who they can market this to, maybe non-competing firms or things like that. But it was a great way for companies like technology companies to have research and development paid for. In the first case, supply push innovations, you may create technologies that never find a market. In the latter, demand pull innovations, you may miss out on technologies for which a market has not emerged. So you have to manage these trade-offs, right? So if your organization has ways of using some of these innovations, like 3M, for instance, has a terrific capacity for leveraging the different types of innovations that they come up with into products. Like they're good at doing that. Corning Glass is also good at doing that. So you have to create a technology, or a culture rather, where technology can find its way into products. That's an important part of that, especially if you're creating technologies, from a supply push perspective. From a demand pull perspective, you've got to make sure you can get something to market quickly, and that you're not competing with the customer that actually brought you in to help you. So the challenge for leadership: how are we expecting innovation to create value for our customers and our company? This is, seems like a really obvious thing, but oftentimes, research and development and innovation dollars are not necessarily associated with, a strategy for creating value for customers. And it's really important that we do focus on the customer. How are we going to change the customer's experience with our company so that they either pay more, buy more, save money, create some sort of value, so that we capture the value associated with the innovation. Create a high-level plan for allocating resources to the different kinds of innovation. Again, if you've got something coming out of R&D, you're going to need manufacturing, you're going to need engineering, marketing, you're going to need sales. All these resources are going to need to be aligned so that you can get a product to market. Because that's where we're going to get the value. We have to have somebody buy it in order to get the value. Leadership has to be able to manage these trade-offs, understanding where these resources need to go and where we think the most value for the company is going to be created, and then recognize that innovation strategies must evolve. So this last bullet supports the reading that we did from Courier, where technologies build on each other. So we may have something that maybe we can't use right away, but as we understand more of the capabilities of a new innovation, or we find a product and we can back up and say, hey, what if we apply this innovation to this product? And then serendipity itself. So we've read about that as well, that sometimes when you have a goal, when you set a strategy in place, it helps people to find opportunities to leverage the resources and to create value in the market. And that's it. That's the end of Pisano. Thanks, everybody.